So thanks, Gary, and welcome.
Okay, well, I'm in an echo chamber, so at KU, but that's because I have better bandwidth. So we're having a little technology. So Jack I have a first slide, how technology got in your wallet.
You're correct. You're right where you want to be.
All righty. I did this for the Endicott Society back in April, so that's why April 19th is the date. So I started with, it's going to be tales, tall tales, myths, rumors, conjectures, and I'll do a little bragging at the end. So one of the first things I want you to think about is, well, again, I did this, how many computers do you have around you today? Think about counting right now, but almost everyone has some kind of a smartphone. And some of you might have a watch. I still have to wind mine in the morning. And some of you have key fobs to open your car. That's got a computer in it. And we have laptops. And today we have credit cards that have these little magic things on the front of them. That's a computer. And some of us drive fancy cars. And a modern car has maybe 100 computers in it. They turn on the lights. You've heard of Hyundai and Kia. And then a few of us have hearing aids. They have computers in it. So computers are, the thing I want to get across is, at this point, is computers are all around us. Some indoors, some in other things. So this is a story out of the New York Times a couple of months ago, back in February. So 2 men went fishing in Alaska. One said, "If you build it, I'll buy it." That was one trip. The other fisherman said, "If you buy it, I'll build it." That was Bill Allen. The result was a 747. Now, I hope a few of you have flown a 747. But that's one way that technology, the aircraft industry, got into your wallet for you to buy an airplane ticket. I like that. And so one trip was CEO of Pan Am, and Bill Allen was CEO of Boeing. And as the story goes, I told you tales and tall tales. 2 fishermen went to Alaska. If you build it, I'll buy it. If you buy it, I'll build it. And it's one of the most amazing airplanes ever built, the 747. And I'm expecting a few of us have flown on one over the years. So in this talk, I'm thinking a little bit, well, how did this come apart? I mean, that was a vision, but it was also, in some sense, serendipity. This is an eye chart. It's out of a National Research Council report 30 years ago. But it shows the interaction between when government invested in some research topics, when industry invested, and when it became a market. So those are three things that come into play here: research, industry, and markets. And this is a little more close up, but things we use every day. Time sharing simply means you can have Word open here, and Excel open there, and Mail open there, and they all work together. But again, the chart shows when did government invest, when did industry invest, and when did it become a market? So those are some things. So I try to tell this of dreams, vision, drive, need. So this first section is, I call it the internet, but not the web. So there was a guy in I guess in the early 60s, J.C.R. Licklider, who envisioned this idea of a network of funding, and in 1960. So another theme I want to get across is the ideas that we get to use every day have a long history. So I had this idea of funding internet and time sharing and so forth. He funded a guy named Douglas Engelbart, who is at Stanford Research Institute, and actually I think maybe nope. Well, this is not going to work. But Engelbart did in the early mid-late 60s did what we call in the tech industry, it's called the mother of all demos. And if Zoom was actually working right, there'd be a URL out. Anyway, but so Licklider, again, an eye chart, I'll try not to read it, but Bob Taylor went to work. He was what we call a program manager. So he doled out your tax dollars at a little, I always call it a little place called ARPA and IPTO, and he was funding research around the country. I think MIT, and I want to say Utah, and maybe CMU and Berkeley, UCLA. And all of a sudden he had 3 teletype terminals in his office, and he did not have room for a 4th. And so he said, hey, what if we tried to make a system that would connect MIT, I'm going to make this up. Remember, I said myths. MIT to Utah to UCLA to maybe Berkeley and who knows who else. How do we connect them together? And so he had this idea, and it was driven by Licklider. And so he went to his boss, Charlie Hertzfeld at DARPA, who was the office director, and he says, hey, I've got this idea. And Charlie says, okay, yeah, here's $1 million, go do it. Serendipity, ideas, vision. But Bob Taylor went on to form a group at Xerox PARC, which Palo Alto Research Center, and is what whatever it says, their computer science lab, and that group actually created the first, what we today would call the first personal computer. Chuck Thacker built the Alto. That was hardware. We got Ethernet, which is now turned into, in most of your homes, turns into Wi-Fi, but the initial ideas came out of both Xerox PARC and actually out of Hawaii with AlohaNet, laser printing, which we all love, and word processing. What you see is what you get. And in 1968, as the quote says, Bob Taylor says, in a few years, we'll be able to communicate more effectively through machines than face to face. Well, I don't know about that, but we do use our computers day in, day out. That was the mid 70s. Alan Kay worked at Xerox PARC, had this idea in 1968. He got his degree at Utah, but he called it the Dynabook. And if this is a sketch, but if you look at it, it's your iPad. So again, part of the theme I'm trying to convey is the ideas that we live with today started long, long ago. Another eye chart. This is the preamble to a bill that was submitted to the Senate in early 1991 called the High Performance Computing Act. Eventually turned into what we call HPCC, High Performance Computing and Communications. And I've highlighted a few of the goals. I'm not going to read them. So we joke about Al Gore inventing the internet. And it's not a joke. This is from, I think of it as Thomas, but it's Library of Congress or whoever. Senator Gore in January of 1991 submitted a bill for high performance computing. One of the things to note is he's the only author. He's the sole author of that bill in the Senate that eventually was passed later in the year. And the other thing, I didn't put it here, that bill was only 11 pages long. So one author, one bill, 11 pages compared to the 3,000 we get today. And that provided about $1 billion a year of research to I think about 10 agencies. If I was supposed to look it up this morning, but it was NIH and NSF and DIA, and there were about 10 agencies working that in different areas. So if you like your HIPAA, that's where it came from. And if you like your ICDs, if you go to a medical office, that's where it came from. So that's kind of the technology side. I'll turn to the so-called the web. Another very interesting person was Vannevar Bush in the 40s, who had this idea called the Memex, this idea that you had a device that store books and so forth. He wrote a paper called As We May Think in 1945. Well, guess what? We have the web. But the ideas, the concepts, Jack help, 40 years, no, 80 years old. Still in the 60s, a guy named Ted Nelson envisioned creating something. He had a project he called Xanadu. Create references from one page to another page, but that was in the 60s. And here's the reference to the mother of all demos. In the 80s, the librarians and publishers had this idea called SGML, markup languages. So you can say something like paragraph, blah, 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 end of paragraph. And so you added annotation into your text, and it became an international standard. But we use it today. It's called HTML. That's what web pages are written in. In the late 80s, early 90s, Tim Berners-Lee developed what he called the hypertext transport protocol and markup language, HTML. It's done at CERN, which is outside of next to Geneva. And it's just idea to make data more available. And it was deployed in late 80s, December 99. But hey, you get the web today. And he has a few comments about doing that. Very early in the 90s, thing home here to KU, Lou Montulli, was almost a KU graduate. He decided to go to a startup called Netscape, but he did work on links at KU, academic computing. We had this again. This is very, very early in the Lou and I argued. Lou said argued against what we call state. Does your browser know, or does the server know anything about your browser? And his argument was the web is stateless until he invented cookies. And he invented cookies so that you could do shopping easier. So he worked with Mark Andreessen. They worked on what was called the Mosaic browser at NCSA, which is at Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. That was funded by the government. It was funded by National Science Foundation and DARPA to fund doing the browser. And the result was Netscape. And about 1994, I'd learned Netscape went public, and Lou is now a $20 million a year. So anyway, enjoy your cookies. There is a history at KU about cookies. So I'll do a little bragging now. So in 1991, I enjoyed a sabbatical at Digital Equipment Corporation in Palo Alto. And this is the group that was out of Park. So I worked with Chuck Thacker, who built the first personal computer, and Bob Taylor, who managed that project, and many, many others who were just the most amazing people I've ever worked with. And we had a meeting, as I recall, remember, myths, conjectures, and whatnot. But we had a meeting on a Wednesday afternoon. And Chuck turned to me and said, well, what would you do with the project was called AN2, AutoNet 2 at KU. And I go to the whiteboard and I draw a picture. I said, well, I'd hook up Learned, which is then engineering. I'd hook up Malott because Tom Anderson was over there in physics. I'd hook up ACS, the computing services, and then I'd hook up Nichols, which was our research. And so that's, you know, not the exact diagram, but pretty close to what I drew on the whiteboard. So that was Wednesday, as I recall, Wednesday between 4 and 5 p.m. Thursday at noon, Chuck comes back to me and says, we'll do it. So all of a sudden, I had to build a computer network. But that got KU on the map. We put together a network that literally, you know, went from Nichols Hall on the West Campus near the Lead Center to Kansas City to Sioux Falls, South Dakota to Minneapolis. And today it's not, but 1991, that was a 2 gigabit per second network that Sprint and Nortel and a team put together. The reason for Sioux Falls is that's where the Aeros data center is located. They're the repository for all the imagery, satellite imagery for USGS and NASA. Minnesota, because they had a supercomputer. And you know, you never should read your old proposals because we have this link from Nichols to, it shows Southern California. It really should be up in San Francisco. So you always find typos in your old reports. But this is actually out of report to, I guess, OMB of high-speed test beds in the US, but KU is part of that. And that's because Chuck Thacker said, we'll do it. Serendipity. We got an email one time saying, you will attend the NETS PI meeting in New Orleans. Now, my friend Victor and I, we did not budget for traveling to New Orleans, but when your program manager says you'll be there, you go there. So we listened to what and that at that time it was really dark, but what they wanted to do. There was this idea of a global information infrastructure, GII. And this is my one DoD there we go. I call it a lightning chart, but we had this idea of linking, how do we link mobile, very rapidly deployable mobile forces, it's DoD, via satellite, via aircraft carrier, back to CONUS, what we call CONUS, the continental US. How do we link all these things together? And so that was their idea. And KU, we submitted 3 proposals and we got 2 of them funded. And that funding lasted, the 2 that were funded lasted, I think, for 6 years. Lots of grad students. And our third one was, quote, selectable, which meant it met the criteria, but they didn't have the money. So KU got very involved in networking through that effort from the early 90s through actually the aughts in networking. So that's one way technology got in your wallet. We're at a meeting, a workshop in DC, and program manager pulled me aside after lunch and says, well, how would you like to come to work at ARPA? And I go, I had no idea what that meant. But again, KU was very involved in the networking. We were getting involved with the research area, and I decided it was time to, hey, we got to go to DC. So dug out my family and we moved to DC, and for 2 years, and I got to hand out your taxpayer money, but it was all good. We did not do anything bad with it. And that was absolutely fun. And then a couple years later, I was chatting with my friend Chuck Taylor, and I said, Chuck, why did you ever visit KU in the mid 80s? And he says, I've never been to Kansas before. And so again, vision, serendipity, chance, whatever you want to call it, that's kind of how technology gets in your wallet. I shortened this up. Speech recognition, some of us use Siri and whatever the Amazon and the Google thingy is, but that technology goes back to the mid-50s at Bell Labs, and different ways of modeling the voice, funding for AI in the 70s, 80s. But again, the idea is that the things we use today go back a long time. Integrated circuits. The current Apple chip has on the order of 20 billion transistors. I don't know how to handle 20 billion anythings. But it was late 50s when Jack Kilby and Robert Noyce invented the integrated circuits, and Kansas has a little tie to Kilby. He lived in Dodge City or south central Kansas for a while. But in the 80s, there was a key team, we call them Meade and Conway, Carver Meade and Lynn Conway. Meade was at Caltech and Conway was at Xerox PARC. And they did a book that took you through the development of integrated circuits. So that was in the 80s, but as those students who went through our early courses, who now build 20 billion transistors on a chip. So again, the technology has this long time frame. Today, the so-called AI is the hype of the month. But again, those ideas of, can I get a computer to do even a little bit of reasoning, goes back to the late 50s. We had case-based reasoning. You know, you walk into a new restaurant, but when you go into that brand new restaurant, you base your expectations on other restaurants you've been in. So if you go into a new restaurant, you kind of say, okay, well, is there a hostess at the table, you know, the stand, where's the menu, blah, blah, blah. So these ideas go back into the 50s. This idea of neural networks goes back to an idea called perceptrons, actually in the mid 40s to early 50s. So again, the ideas that we're using today have a good background. So, so I guess in this talk of how did technology get in your wallet is history. The ideas are old. Vision, people thought out ahead. Serendipity. Some things we have today just came about because two people sat together on a plane. But my last thought is, so I'm over here in government and research area, but you can't do the research in a university without some interaction with industry. And so those two play together. But you also have to have policies and laws and regulation. Yes, Al Gore did invent the internet, but that was on the policy and legal side of passing laws to make things happen. But you also need regulation. I'm not going to launch a multi-million-dollar satellite unless I know I have the right radio frequencies I can use. So you can't have just a wild west kind of market. You need some assurance that, and then you need a market. I can have the best technology, but if I can't sell it, if I don't have anyone to buy, I'm lost. So, happy sailing. And now I need to get out of something here. Okay, I stopped sharing.
Gary, there is a question in the chat. Please to explain what you meant, and I think you kind of did, but explain what you meant by in your wallet. Was it
Okay. Well, take the 747. Maybe a few of you have flown on a 747. And to fly on that 747, you have to take money out of your wallet. So to get access to that technology, you had to take money out of your wallet. You have an iPhone. How'd you get an iPhone? You took money out of your wallet to get that iPhone. So credit cards. So that's we buy a lot of technology, phones, whatnot. So that's where it came from.
Yeah, I think your last chart where it said you have to have a market kind of explains all that.
It does. It does. If you don't have a market.
The other part of the same question is you said so-called artificial intelligence, and somebody caught that when you said that, and would like a further explanation of what you mean by that.
Well, mumble. Been in the business for a while, and I think I use so-called because I can't say it's real. It's not imitation. When we did our program, our computer engineering, we called it machine intelligence, which I think is a better term. Was at the Endicott yesterday, and Richard DeGeorge, who's taught philosophy at KU for decades, had a very eloquent description. I guess my take would be when an AI machine walks through the Campanile down the hill to graduation at KU, then maybe we'll have something closer to real intelligence. I don't know. It's up for debate.
One of the questions that I had is, and I think you made a really good point of the history and how far back the early thinking about what's resulted in our modern electronics and computing is today. But so it's been 80 years in some respects, 60 or so in others. But would you agree that it's accelerating at a pretty unbelievable speed as we move to each level, that it's getting faster and more is coming quicker as time has gone by?
Yes and no. And the yes part is, yeah, we're doing a lot more stuff. You know, I'm reading a paper this morning about Amazon managing storage, memory, and so forth. And so, yes, if we look at the curves from 1910 to today, they just shoot up. But if you go back and look at the curves from 1910 to 1930, they have the same shape. So my guess is, I mean, go back and think about airplanes. Right? 1903, the Wright brothers did their first flight at Kitty Hawk. And by 1920s, if I recall right, there was a U.S. Post office airmail system in place. That's pretty impressive growth in 20 years. So sometimes I look at the curves and I go, oh yeah, well, yeah, they're really great today, but now take the curves from long ago, they look so great. They're the same greatness. So I don't know.
All right. Any other questions anybody have in the chat? Or if you feel like unmuting and asking a question, feel free to do so. We don't have to go to our full hour if nobody has any more questions, but.
Well, I guess either, but.
Gary, I was just curious.
Oh, Dave?
Yeah, I was curious about market. How much money gets poured into something with no market whatsoever?
Yeah.
And does market end up driving the money that'll go into it, or is it the other way around?
Mumble market. I mean, my take is I can build the best technology in the world as a academic. If I can't sell it, it ain't going nowhere.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about barcoding. That laid around for 20 years. Went into a supermarket in 74, but the guy invented it in the 50s.
There's barcoding,
market.
and there's a guy, you know, the other one that comes to mind is standard size shipping containers. Yeah. I think the guy who came up with the idea, I think that was in the early 60s, of, oh, let's standardize the size of shipping containers. And probably fought for years and years, and then finally got through. And now we see them everywhere. I mean,
yeah.
So there's, to me, there's a lot of that technology we just kind of take for granted. Shipping containers or barcodes, and sometimes it takes a long time for those ideas to come around and people buy into them eventually, and so I mean, again, that was part of my idea of saying of when I put this talk together, of saying, hey, the ideas we get to use today have a long history. So,
Other questions, anyone?
Yeah, I'm fine. Since I'm constantly clicking on the yes, I accept that you have cookies, I don't completely understand, but I can't get in if I don't. So you said something about it was developed and is primarily for selling or
Yes. So Lou was at a company called Netscape, and they did a browser. The browser came out of Illinois, and he was having trouble keeping connections between, oh, you selected that book,
Mhm.
and then you'd come back later and they'd have no idea that you selected that book, or you said, I want to check out. So he came up with this idea now called a cookie, which has another long history. And he did a great interview. He says, "Hey, look, I did it for a particular purpose. I didn't realize it would propagate to Bean. Hey, I just visited LL Bean looking for shirts, and the next time I click on the New York Times, LL Bean pops up." He didn't see that cross tracking that could happen. So, but yeah. And the only thing KU can say, he almost graduated.
well, I'll keep clicking the cookies because it doesn't really bother me too much.
All right, any other questions before we let Gary go? Well, I, for one, want to thank him. If you want to unmute and show your appreciation with some applause or just a wave, really appreciate your joining us and giving a background. I learned a bunch of stuff I didn't know. So thanks very much. Appreciate it, Gary.
All righty. Thank you.
And it's, it's hard enough to get in and do a presentation on a Zoom like this, but to know all of us are going to see Gary at the next meeting or the next event makes it even tougher. So I give him even more credit for
Thank you, all I can say is thank you, Apple.
Yeah. And after all that computer stuff, it took us only about 10 minutes to figure out how to get his screen shared. So, all right. So thank you all for coming once again.
Bye-bye.
And we'll see you at the next event
Tomorrow.
that you guys are that choose to